has been the Associate Director at the Monk School's Global Migration Lab and is generally somebody who I would consider a very active and engaged citizen and refugee advocate, both on the Canadian end and on the international end. And I'm hoping, other than talking about the tragedy of Europe, he'll also talk a little bit about his engaged projects as part of telling us about his research. I told him that he has a maximum of 45 minutes, so there is ample of time of questions from all of you, because that's the most exciting part, I think, about the talks, is to have the exchange going. So I'll hand it over to Craig and any additional introductory remarks that you'd like to make about what you're doing at the Migration Lab. And other than that, you're welcome to take it away. We don't have a clicker, so that's why Craig's standing over there. So that's his only way of advancing the slides, because we don't have one from sitting over here. But thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Dagmar. Hi, everybody. I didn't know that I was going to talk about anything but this, but in the Q&A, I guess we can talk about engagement and activism.
Since there's so many students here, I think that's always important.
Sure. Okay, so anyway, but thank you for having me. So what I'm going to do today, the talk that I'm going to give today is based on the data and findings from my PhD research, but this tragedy angle that I'm trying to give it, or this tragedy spin, is kind of the novel framing and theoretical focus, because it's now revised as a book manuscript for Cambridge, and I'm hoping to finish it and submit it next month. So feel free to be really mean to me and hard on me about the spin and tell me if it's total crap, because the editors haven't seen it yet. Okay, so what follows, I'm going to give an international relations explanation of how the European project, which is supposed to be this unprecedented historical example of progress in international politics, generates crises around its peripheries and arguably increasingly at home inside Europe. And my main claim, which I'll substantiate in a short case study, is that in pursuing the positive security dividends of deep integration, Europe developed what it called a series of compensatory measures for open borders and free mobility, and that these compensatory measures are focused on irregular migration controls, and then causally that these compensatory measures cause changes in irregular migration systems that generate insecurity around Europe's peripheries. So my plan is I'm going to start with a couple basic IR concepts and tell you what I mean by tragedy. Then I'm going to give a bit of historical background about the development of the European project, particularly how its open border regime came about and how bureaucratically they developed their irregular migration control policies. Then I'm going to talk about some more empirical work on variables and the causal relationship between that open border regime and insecurity on Europe's peripheries. And then I'm going to end with a short historical case study on deals that Italy and the EU made with Muammar Gaddafi from around 2000 to 2009. And I'm going to say that that's diagnostic of my causal claims. Okay, so let me start with some IR theory. Okay, so for IR scholars, international relations scholars, there's two big questions. What are the causes of war, and what are the conditions for peace? For many IR scholars and for the practitioners that actually developed the European project, European integration culminating in the European Union was an answer to both of these questions. And without a doubt, the chances of war in Europe are remarkably low right now, and that might seem like a normal and facile thing, but when we think about the history of conflict in the European Union or on the European continent, and the radical change from that to what we recognize now as Europe, are quite profound. And there's a lot of explanations as to why, different theoretical and causal claims as to why, but fundamentally the answer is that the project of integration locked European states into a progressive collective project. Where's that? And it was a way out of what IR scholars call a security dilemma. So the security dilemma, I mean, everybody maybe here took Poli-Sci 101, so you know what security dilemmas are, but in this anarchic world system that we have, states can never be sure of one another's intentions, and they're fundamentally responsible for their own security. So there's no hierarchy in the system, there's no night watchman, and that's what IR scholars mean by anarchy. It doesn't mean chaos, it just means nothing above. Therefore, in the international system, there's no status quo powers, at least not for long. States always want more security, and for most of history, that's meant balancing their military and economic power against other states. Now, the tragedy of the security dilemma is that in attempting to maximize their power and relative advantage, states always threaten other states who want the same thing. And that's the nature of making choices under anarchy. What one state sees as their own defensive behavior, another state might see as offensive behavior and threatening. And the classic example of this is arms races, or the overlapping and cascading defensive and offensive treaties that led to World War I. In another reading of the security dilemma, the accumulation of power, so when states become great powers, can draw them down this kind of path of choices to their eventual demise. So we think of Nazi Germany invading the Soviet Union, or the Anglo-American Axis embarking on this kind of crusade of regime change with no real plan, other than the belief in the infallibility and righteousness of their fight against evil, or their quest for oil, depending on how you look at that one. And there's numerous critiques of the security dilemma, but the fundamental tragedy is that in attempting to make security or make states secure, they actually create insecurity. So now to tragedy. So the daily use of the term tragedy, when we use it in the kind of common sense, we mean when terrible things happen to good people, when you say something is tragic. But the ancient Greeks, of course, since they came up with the term, had a more nuanced understanding of it. According to Aristotle, for something to be a tragedy, so these tragic plays, for something to be a tragedy, it was about the catharsis that the audience felt in watching a tragic hero make choices that would lead to their demise, and then watching them as they come to this kind of realization that the choices that they've made will have, tragic consequences. It's a reversal of fortunes. The way that the plot lines work in tragedies is this kind of hubris. The hubris kind of dawns on the hero, the tragic hero, by the end of the play, and then usually everyone ends up dead on the stage. Tragic heroes have free will, but they're often hemmed in by big structures and forces that are beyond their control, often which they help to create. Or their eventual ruin and the ruination of those around them come about because of an unyielding and often hubristic commitment to otherwise noble values like patriotism or commitment to the family. And then later theories, if we think of Hegelian understandings of history, tragedies come about between two opposing, but they can be equally virtuous forces when only one can come out on top. And then finally, for something to be tragic, there has to be some great height that's achieved or inherited through some kind of project from which the hero or the project can fall. Luckily, we don't live in Greek tragedies, and as constructivist IR scholars tell us, anarchy is what states make of it. We have choices in the way that we build political institutions, and we can reinterpret and reinvent structures. And in knowing history, we're not doomed to repeat it. States are not condemned to the security dilemma. So turning back to those two fundamental questions in IR, the European project offered a way out of the security dilemma and the tragedy that it entailed. After World War II, European states began to embark on what IR scholars call the project towards a security community. Right? This was a term coined by the theorist Karl Deutsch in 1957, but then taken up again by Michael Barnett and Emmanuel Adler, who was one of my professors at the U of T, in a book in 1998. And so in security communities, states group together, often linked by common past experiences, shared values, and transnational linkages, and reject violence as a form of conflict resolution. And security communities use institutions and laws and deep and broad linkages to create what they call an extended shadow of the future, and creating dependable expectations for peaceful change. And the European project is the best, most significant case of this. Security communities, and this is important, don't do away with states' interests in maximizing their security. They just do it in a different way. And according to theorists of security communities, especially when we look at Europe, a liberal security community can not only create security for the actors inside of it who've pooled together, but it can start spreading liberal values in a way that's not coercive and is based on the powers of attraction and emulation rather than coercive force. And so now you're probably wondering, what does all this stuff about tragedies and security dilemmas and security communities have to do with migration and borders? Or maybe you're not. So in order to embark on this project of progressive change, European states increasingly ceded what we understand as like really fundamental core aspects of state sovereignty supranationally to bodies which would eventually form the core institutions of the European Union. And this change was really profound and important. So they relinquished some jurisdiction and legislation to what would become the European Court of Justice. They pooled their executive functions in the European Commission. They joined an economic and monetary union through the European Central Bank. And perhaps most fundamentally and most importantly for my argument, they dropped borders and offered free mobility of goods, services, and people within the EU. And all of these were means to achieving the noble goal of the European project and the prosperity that peaceful coexistence brought. But as I can argue, those choices came with negative consequences, which have now arguably have come home to roost for Europe. So open borders and free mobility, which we call the Schengen regime in Europe, are fundamental and even constitutive aspects of the European project. And it's not too much of a stretch to say that without Schengen, the European project would be so different that we wouldn't understand it or wouldn't recognize it as the same thing. If we think about what it means to go to Europe today, we don't think about it in the same way that people would have thought about it even 30 years ago. And this isn't just my claim. Angela Merkel, Juncker, Donald Tusk, and a range of other heads of states all claim that during the 2015 migration crisis, if Schengen failed, the European project would also fail. Likewise, people that I spoke with, so just foreshadowing a bit, this is, the data is based on about 3 years of field work that I'll explain in a little bit. This is from a person from the European Commission who was in charge of creating this regional dialogue process called the Khartoum process, which is much maligned because basically they work with only authoritarian states to contain irregular migration. So it's confidential or not for attribution, but this is the person basically in charge of it. He says, the Parliament's interested in migrant rights and rule of law. So are we. So this is me asking him about what about the human rights abuses, basically. But we also see the big picture, and a secure Europe comes before the full human rights for migrants in North Africa. We can't change authoritarian states. Our job is protecting Europe, protecting the treaties, protecting the project. That was his answer about exporting human rights abuses. And the success and access to Schengen and the common market and free mobility and all of that was also the ultimate incentive for getting accession and candidate states to comply with EU conditionalities. So very often in the literature they call access to Schengen and the free market the golden carrot that they can hold above other states to get them to comply with EU conditionalities. This was why post-Cold War states in Eastern Europe made all the concessions they did to join the European Union. It was that access. And this is why Balkan states now, which are sometimes pre-accession states, sometimes candidate states, are kind of stuck in this never-ending dance with Europe. But Schengen was always predicated on what we call compensatory measures for controlling irregular migration. This is also on your handout. Opening internal borders meant strengthening external borders. And not only that, but projecting migration controls outside of Europe. No compensatory measures meant no Schengen. And no Schengen meant no European project, at least insofar as we'd realize it today. So compensatory measures, I won't go over these in detail, but they're basically comprised of internal and external measures. We can talk about these in the discussion if you want. The takeaway point here is that the internal measures rarely work, and the EU relies mostly on the external compensatory measures for controlling irregular migration. I forgot to start my timer. How much time do I have? 20 minutes? 30? Anyway, the history for how this stuff came about is also really important for us to understand my claim, and it's, I think, maybe a bit of a contentious claim that Europe causes migration crises and that the whole European project causes insecurity around its peripheries. So I'm going to give you a bit of the history. The end of the Cold War was this really pivotal moment for the development of the European project and simultaneously its orientation towards irregular migration. German reunification, alarmism around influxes of migrants from post-Soviet states, a new focus on irregular migration into Europe, eventually the dissolution of Yugoslavia and all of the IDPs and refugees generated from that, and all the domestic concern over those things elevated migration and elevated asylum from a more kind of socioeconomic issue to an issue of high politics and a security issue. And the impending supranational EU that was just kind of being born or coming to fruition at this time allowed member states to upload all of those concerns to the way that the institutions were built and constructed in the first place. So to go back a bit further, by the 1970s, Europe had become, for the first time, a continent of immigration, predominantly through labor migration from post-colonial countries. And despite the 1973 economic downturn, chain migration and family reunification combined to increase overall migration at a time when domestic sentiment was already starting to turn against it. And this offered, for the first time, the space for European politicians to start drumming up fears around uncontrolled migration in a way that we would consider quite contemporary, but also we tend to consider it novel. Governments in response tightened labor and immigration and family reunification, but these were matched by newly robust rights discourses and legal decisions and the emergence of big civil society groups like ECRI, the European Council for Refugees and Exiles, that pushed back against these tightened laws. And domestic courts in many states started enforcing liberal interpretations of laws. And so famously, as the Max Frisch quote goes, we asked for workers and we got people instead. And the stage was set now for politicians really to bring these concerns forward into European structures. So beginning in the 1980s, the EU was basically divided between an in-migration north and an out-migration south. But by the late to mid-1980s, southern states had shifted for the first time in a long time to in-migration countries. And that was predominantly through irregular migration, people overstaying work visas, and increasingly people coming across in boats, though that's a very small proportion of it. But the important thing to recognize is that because of the emerging EU, because of the emerging European structures, and open borders first inside the Benelux countries and then through Schengen, this became a concern for all of Europe. So there needed to be a European response to it. And these new closed migration regimes, where there used to be circular labor migration movement between North Africa and Southern Europe, these closed migration regimes and sanctions on employers had the kind of pernicious effect of incentivizing people to overstay visas and and therefore growing the irregular migration population. The early 90s also saw asylum crises in Northern Europe. Total asylum applications to European OECD countries more than doubled in only 3 years, from 320,000 asylum applications in 1989 to 695,000 asylum applications in 1992. Then, as more recently, Germany received the most, and Germany proposed a European-wide redistribution scheme based on its own redistribution schemes, which didn't go anywhere. Sounds quite familiar. And this was the result of changing conflict dynamics in the global south. We can talk about those after if you want. The thing to recognize is that over this period, the profile of the average asylum seeker and refugee in Europe changed from an exile from communism, who for Europe was a political victory. Every person who was voting for freedom and democracy with their feet turned into a racialized person fleeing persecution from the global south. At the same time, the closed immigration regimes meant that economic migrants had to resort to asylum claims to enter Europe, and which gave rise to the narrative around bogus asylum claims, and again pushed domestic public sentiment against this. And so in this period when Europe was I didn't give you a timeline of the treaties, did I? No. In this period when Europe was writing the treaties and going through all the negotiations and starting to create its bureaucratic structures around what would be a security policy and what would be an economic policy and what would be a social policy, all of these things started pushing and militating towards including migration as a security policy, and thinking about migration only in terms of irregular migration and asylum for Europe. And reading back on the debates at this time, I mean, it's really didactic. It sounds like the debates that we hear today about the need for common responses to asylum crises, et cetera, et cetera. You could be reading newspapers from today when you read back on the European Commission decisions from this time, but also the press from this time. And just to reiterate, the agreement on the removal of systematic controls at internal borders was always going to be predicated on Europe's external borders, since access to one state would mean unfettered access to other states. Article 17 of the Schengen Agreement from 1985, so before all this stuff started happening, before the end of the Cold War, stated this specifically, right? If you want to get rid of internal borders, you have to fortify your external borders. From the mid-1970s even to the late 1980s, security personnel and high-level policymakers and bureaucrats from police, judiciaries, border control agencies met in these closed-door fora, the most notorious that scholars talk about a lot as if it's like this ruthless cabal that's meeting. It's called the Trevi Group. I don't know if people have heard of this. The Trevi Group, it was a French acronym. Is that the right word? An acronym. Acronym. That's it. The Trevi Group, it was terrorism, radicalism, extremism, and violence. So they were meeting because of real security concerns, like domestic left-wing and right-wing terrorism in the 70s in Europe, hijackings, for the first time, kind of mass drug shipments, things like this. But very quickly, these working groups started looking at irregular migration as their kind of primary concern, and asylum as their primary concern. External borders were also at the fore of the European Council meeting in Edinburgh in 1992, which was a really important moment. That was to discuss the ratification of the Maastricht Treaty, which would essentially create the European Union as a legal entity. And this is from the preamble of the official communique that stated that to meet the objectives of the original Treaty of Rome, to create the European Union, to have open borders, that's not possible, quote, without creating dangers for public security and compromising the fight against illegal immigration. Right? All of a sudden, the whole danger to the European project becomes illegal immigration at this time. Fast forward a bit to the 1999 Amsterdam Treaty, which was also another one of the big European treaties. that's the first time that Europe, in treaty form, so in law, starts explicitly linking what it would start calling the area of freedom, security, and justice. So this is the thing that encapsulates all the positive rights and the positive developments of what the European project is. So it's immediately linking those things, and in law, linking the success of the AFSJ, the area of freedom, security, and justice, with the success of combating irregular and illegal migration. This culminated in the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. I'm going to skip over that. Suffice it to say that the way that Europe built its treaties, the way that the discussions happened, the very core of building the European project was kind of always, but became fundamentally predicated on controlling irregular migration. Okay, so to take a step back and talk about the kind of causal argument for a second, are people familiar with this term, Europeanization? And so this is basically the causal analysis of how this project, of how European integration causes things domestically. And it looks at changes in domestic governance and political structures. So that's the dependent variable, are caused by European regional integration. That's the independent variable, the thing that's doing the causing. Most of the research around this comes from looking at the 2004 and 2007 enlargements to Central and Eastern Europe, because that's when it was most obvious and there was the most conditionality. Also because this is framed as the big success story of the European project and European foreign policy. It could use its powers of attraction to have these states that for generations have been, in this narrative, locked behind the Iron Curtain and bring them back into the fold of Europe, because Europe was this pinnacle of progress. And again, it was always based, their compliance was based on this kind of golden carrot of access to free mobility. Most Europeanization literature looks at what I call benign Europeanization. Okay, so this is changes at the domestic level around good governance, rule of law, civil society, minority rights, all these positive things that being part of Europe entails. And anyone who looks at Europe's current enlargement plans, this is how, whether or not this stuff is happening is how they measure the tug of war between Europe and Russia and the Balkans. It's how they look at democratic and rule of law backsliding in Poland and Hungary. It's how we know Turkey's never going to join the EU, etc. But scholars also look at what they call now Europeanization beyond Europe. And that's this relationship, the relationship of Europeanization. So how does regional integration affect non-candidate third countries? And I'm not going to get into the literature here, but basically my claim is that scholars are completely misguided into looking for this stuff. A, because the incentive structures aren't there, and B, because there's no evidence for it whatsoever. The other reason that they look at it is because this is what Europe says it wants to do. So European foreign policy is based on something called the ENP, the European Neighborhood Policy, or at least it was until a couple of years ago. This is Europe's broad, overarching foreign policy framework. The year is important for when they're writing this. Europe wanted to set itself, it wanted to secure and kind of emulate what it had done in Central and Eastern Europe, but B, it wanted to set itself against the kind of Anglo-American democratization by regime change type thing. Right? This is also the year that the war on terror is really kicking into high gear, and the Middle East is about to be destabilized and culminate in the 2015 refugee crisis in Europe. So what they wanted to do was use their powers of attraction, use access to markets, slow incremental access to markets, to spread good governance, support social and political reform, dealing with corruption and abuse of power, establishing the rule of law and protecting human rights. So these are the best means for strengthening the international order. So back to the tragedy argument, right? These aren't bad things to do, right? This is European hubris talking about authoritarian states where it needs to make deals around irregular migration to protect the European project And it's going to do that in states where, if a state did this, it means regime change for that state, right? There's no state where Europe is making migration deals now where if they didn't do those things, it would mean a fundamental transformation of those states. And it's not that people working in the European bureaucracy and making these policies didn't know this. This is from an interview I did just this summer with a guy who was in his last 2 weeks before retiring. He was very high up in the European External Action Service, basically in charge of migration in Europe's foreign policy. He still smoked in his office. He was a very, I don't know, like pinnacle patriarchal bro, but dapper and Italian. He had a scarf. He smoked in his office. It was fun. And this is him summing up kind of all of it. Keep in mind, this is 2018. This is also 2 days after the European Council Summit in Brussels, where nothing got done because the Interior Minister of Italy and Vice President of Italy was there talking about migration, so they didn't get time to talk about Brexit or a trade war with the US, which are arguably more important things. It's impossible to satisfy the no borders crowd. External borders are part of the Schengen Agreement. No external borders, no Schengen. The rule of law and rights connections are ostensibly built into external relations. That's in the Lisbon Treaty. It's part of the constitutional law of the EU. But we can't dictate what goes on in third countries. We need migration control partners, and we're not walking away from the table because the regime jails some activists or shoots some refugees. Right? This is beyond all the bluster of the official European communications about human rights, etc., expanding protections, development aid. This is what people who've been working on this for their entire careers say about how inside the European Union they make decisions about external migration controls and who they're going to partner with. Back to this claim that benign Europeanization doesn't happen in third countries. That doesn't mean nothing's happening. Right? Very far from it, which is the basis of my empirical argument, which I'll finish in about 8 minutes, and then we can talk. So to develop my causal argument, and in contrast to what I call benign Europeanization, I developed this concept of what I call malignant Europeanization, which is insecurity and regressive practices and norms resulting from European regional integration. So, in the first place in the 90s, I mean, we use this term irregular migration now like it's kind of always been around. It's hard to find the first usage of the term. It's probably with the IOM. Basically, the scholarly consensus is that in the mid-1990s, early 1990s to mid-1990s, when the EU or European states were closing their immigration regimes, and there was big changes in the international refugee regime, arguably driven by European donor states, when the refugee regime turned away from the other durable solutions, and the 90s, according to Sadako Agata, who was the High Commissioner at the time, was going to be the decade of returnees. That's the moment when we get to voluntary return to countries of origin as the preferred durable solution. Right? So these two things happen at the same time and functionally create the market incentives for irregular migration systems and complex irregular migration flows in the way that we understand them now. That's part of the story. And this is everywhere in my research. You see it in this period in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe, in West Africa, in North Africa, the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes, etc. And I'm not saying that Europe caused the push factors or the triggers for people moving. I mean, Schengen didn't cause the Rwandan genocide. Schengen didn't cause the breakup of Yugoslavia. but it affected irregular migration systems and the refugee regime in such a way that incentivized the irregular migration flows that it then became obsessed with controlling in the first place. So this is basically my causal model here. So I say there's Schengen's compensatory measures. Beyond that, there's the assumption that Schengen is its compensatory measures are an inherent part of the EU, right? You don't have the European project without those measures. The causal mechanism is that they materially cause changes in irregular migration systems, and then those changes in irregular migration systems are correlated with my dependent variable, which is malignant Europeanization. And on your handout, I explain how I kind of measure these things a bit more fully. But the research points to kind of 8 metrics for malignant Europeanization across the different cases. I have 3 cases. One's a historical paired case between Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Mediterranean irregular migration system. And then 3 years of field work, 3 and a bit, between Morocco, Egypt, Israel for 2 years-ish, the Western Balkans at the height of the migration crisis from June 2015 to January 2016, and then a lot of trips to Europe to talk to bureaucrats inside the EU. The debate around what's going on now in the Central Mediterranean, what's going on now in Libya, suffers from this kind of weird historical amnesia, right? Like there's something new going on about making deals with authoritarians or militias to stop irregular migration flows. That was always part of EU policy. You see this in West Africa, North Africa, before the stuff that I'm about to talk about. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Europe faced this confluence of these 2 major strategic concerns. One was stopping irregular migration. The other one was diversifying energy supplies away from Russia. And so Gaddafi was able to leverage his geopolitical position in the Central Mediterranean, where the biggest routes were. I'm sure everybody's familiar with what's going on in the Central Mediterranean. Is everybody generally familiar? Ish, we can talk about it in a sec. That offered Libya and Gaddafi the chance to kind of leverage this position to rehabilitate his international position. Then as now, Italy took the lead with the relationship with Libya, but also with the backing of the European Union, specifically the European Commission. Just to kind of push the point home a little bit, this is exactly the time as well. So what else is going on right now around this time? They're signing, they just signed Amsterdam, the Schengen regime just came in. They're expanding the EU into Central and Eastern Europe. The European institutions are growing, they're getting their nice new buildings built in Brussels, and all the policies around how to deal with migration are happening, right? So the guy with the scarf and the cigarettes that I was talking about before is sitting in Brussels hatching these plans, although it's kind of the member states that really drive these plans. The ICMPD, which is a migration kind of think and do tank in Europe, calls this period Italy's main foreign policy focus was what it called its increased and calculated pro-Libya advocacy. Right? This is the guy that 10 years later, I mean, everybody knows what happened to Gaddafi, right? They look pretty chummy right about there. Italian advocacy opened the door for broader European cooperation with Libya. In 2003, so even before the sanctions were lifted on Libya, there was a European Commission exploratory mission that found Libya ready and willing to cooperate on migration. It was this reason, it was the migration cooperation that allowed European states to say, we have to make a deal with Gaddafi. And it was for that reason that he dropped the WMD program, and Europe and the US and the rest of the world were able to lift the sanctions on Libya. Around this time as well, here's another senior policymaker. This person's also in the council, in these kind of permanent standing committees that are called co-rapport, that exist kind of like on the side of the commission, that do all the closed door deals, and then when everybody comes to the council summits, then they just do what they've been negotiating in back rooms for the previous year. There was this notion that Italy was just doing this stuff with Gaddafi, and then everybody just had to kind of follow along because, hey, they cut this deal on migration, so the UNHCR and the EU had to kind of scramble to catch up. That was not the case at all. Right? This is a person explaining how this stuff works in the EU. Of course, every member state knew what Italy was up to with Libya. Every member state has the right to enter into bilateral relationships. The difference in the EU, and this goes back to my main point, is we have a common interest in controlling external borders. And this is where he kind of pointed his finger in my face. The academics believe that when they don't discuss these plans in the council, who would say no? France, the UK, Germany? Better the migration is managed in North Africa than in Calais. Calais being what they call the jungle camp near the tunnel to the UK. It's 2 hours from Brussels. It's a total embarrassment. And then he pulled out his phone and showed me all these pictures and saying, it's a refugee camp in the middle of Europe. Better to let them do it over there. Also around this time, this is the first time that the UK, where is this? The UK floated plans for what it called regional protection zones and transit processing centers in Libya, and these were modeled directly on Australia's so-called Pacific solution. In 2004 and 2005, Germany and Italy jointly advocated for establishing processing camps in Libya, right? Exactly what they're doing now. Skipping ahead a bit, basically over this period, they start cutting these deals. The European Commission, Italy, the UK, Germany, all put in money basically to control Libya's southern border, transfer patrol boats. The total was something like 38 million euros over the period of a few years. Then in 2008 and 2009, around 2008, Italy cuts a deal with Libya, which they call the Friendship Pact. It has a much longer name, which is absurd as Gaddafi's outfits and Berlusconi's hair, I think, which is, I'll tell you what the whole title is later if you want. Basically, it was that Italy and Libya would cooperate to push migrants back. They would transfer them patrol boats, and that the EU would fund the construction of detention centers inside Libya. And the thing is that it worked. So a strong authoritarian leader with control over the irregular migration flows can stop irregular migration flows. Right? This is a kind of a normatively troubling lesson from this and from the EU-Turkey deal. The other thing that happened, and this is the case study, but I kind of need to stop soon to give us time to talk. The case study is that also around this time, you have this really sudden emergence of another migration route. This migration route through the Egyptian Sinai to Israel. And that route was really characterized by a lot of trafficking and really heinous abuses. So that's where I spent 2 years between Israel and Egypt doing research with migrants there. I interviewed about 150 people over the course of the 2 years, and I think it's 95, the total number of migrants that made it into the data for the project. And what you see is that what I wanted to see by talking to migrants about their route choices, about their experiences at borders, about their experiences with security services, was to test and look at the variation in these different things, but then test the causal claim that it was Europe's foreign policy and Europe's migration policy to protect Schengen that caused that change in the route. And I think, I mean, it's not an excellent slide. I could show you the stats tables for it, but this line should be a bit smoother. But basically what you see is that after they sign this agreement, after they have the pushbacks, the crossings in the central Mediterranean drop precipitously. There's a period where they also drop towards Europe because people were basically in hiding. But then the smugglers in the route reconfigured itself, and the crossings into the Sinai increased exponentially. And so my claim is that this is kind of diagnostic of the wider claim that it was Europe's policy that caused this major change. And it's not just that so here you can see by 2010 crossings into the Sinai, right? It worked in the central Mediterranean. Crossings are at an all-time low. 4,500 was the number of crossings in 2010, right? Last year, I think the number of crossings were 145,000 on the same route. And for the first time ever, the crossings through the Sinai into Israel exceeded the crossings across the central Mediterranean, right? The route reconfigured and was replaced. The other thing that was happening at this time was that it wasn't just that the route reconfigured from the Sinai, or from Libya across to the Sinai, but that traffickers and smugglers working in camps and with populations in eastern Sudan and Eritrea and Ethiopia started actively trafficking people up through Egypt into the Sinai for the purposes of extortion, torture for the purposes of extortion of money. What we also saw was that smuggling very often turned into instances of torture, really kind of heinous forms of torture that are, I mean, I really resist the urge of some people to show you pictures of boats of people and desperate people. I don't like doing that. I don't like when other people do it. But trust me that the torture in the Sinai was like really, really heinous. Some of the worst stuff that I think I've ever seen. But what happened, what was interesting was these transnational linkages started forming. So there's this idea that the smuggling and trafficking networks here are these kind of like atomized, one stop, bit by bit, these fragmented journeys, as some people call them. That wasn't the case at all. As soon as the route shifted into the Sinai, there was active trafficking routes all the way up the east coast of Africa, up into Egypt. The other thing was that there was major corruption of security services. And has anybody been to the Sinai, been to Egypt? You can't get into the Sinai without passing the security services, right? There's a bridge and a tunnel, right? Some people I talked to said that they were snuck across the canal. You can't cross the border from Libya across the main coastal highway into Egypt, and you definitely can't get into the Sinai without the collusion of security services. And so this was also part of the things that I was interviewing people about. And the last thing is the collusion between security services on the border between Egypt and Israel. There was a secret meeting between Mubarak and Omar in I think 2006, 2009, I can't remember, where they basically came up with this kind of what they called this hot returns and shoot to stop policy, where the Israelis, with their good night vision and their surveillance equipment on the border, would see the migrants coming at night, shoot flares in the air, and then the Egyptian soldiers would shoot the migrants. Or they would just take them and throw them back over the border. All that stuff was happening in addition to a lot of domestic political contestation inside Israel as a result of this. And we can get into that in the discussion if you want. Okay, so that's the case study. So just to wrap up, I think that understood in this historical context, the novelty of what's going on right now in the central Mediterranean, and the novelty of the 2015 migration crisis in Europe, wears a little thin, wears very thin. And that European response and everything that was going on in 2015 that really like triggered everyone's attention, and this is the thing that everybody wants to focus on, is part of this kind of long historical process. The thing that is novel is that it's getting worse and it seems to be accelerating. And the refugee crisis that Europe experienced in 2015 is one of 6 or 7 that I can identify in my research that have happened, like what happened in the Sinai, around Europe's peripheries since at least the mid-1990s, and they're directly the result of Schengen's compensatory measures, and Schengen's compensatory measures are a constitutive part of the European project, and therefore my argument that it's European integration that's causing these things. And the last bit of the tragedy is that now Europe's painted itself into a corner. So in attempting to protect the European project against irregular migration, it framed and discursively and bureaucratically securitized migration, and then it limited its choice range. It created these structures and narrowed its choice range to the point where now Europe's facing these major demographic pressures. They've got hundreds of thousands of irregular migrants, but any politician who says, let's regularize all these people, we need way more migration or else we're going to face this demographic time bomb, will be booted from office immediately. On the flip side, this kind of xenophobic populist genie has been let out of the bottle. So, populist parties, populist party from Denmark, Austria, Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, Italy, and Slovakia, their main electoral strategy is to blame the European Union, right? The thing that is the pinnacle of progress, to blame Brussels for all of it. And that's why the failure of these internal solidarity mechanisms come in. We're not going to let Brussels tell us that we've got to take in 10,000 refugees. Never. We can't let them tell us that. It's our sovereignty at stake. Then they win elections because of that, right? So the whole thing has inverted on itself because of the choices that Europe's made. And what it's left with is more of the same and even worse around Europe's peripheries. And now it's basically abandoned the European neighborhood project. So this kind of goal of being this liberal paragon to the world has been abandoned in this attempt to protect the gains of the European project, which are now coming home to roost to dissolve the project itself. And I'm going to end there. Thanks.